G'day and welcome to another Space Engineers tutorial. Today we're going to take a look at solar panels. And this one's really more of a test than a tutorial as I don't know the outcomes ahead of time. What I wanted to look at was all of the different factors that might play into how solar panels work and how we would want to use them to their greatest efficiency. Particularly if we're not wanting to use scripts, or if we are using scripts but we're limited in some other way. I've got this same testing rig set up here at the equator. It's also set up at the top of one of the mountains in the temperate / tundra region, and then there's a final testing rig set up right at the pole. All of these rigs are set up exactly the same. What we have is starting with the first grid, 2 solar panels attached to a battery. That battery will store the power that is generated in one day on the planet. The planet that I'm using and the save I'm using has a 30-minute day-night cycle. I wanted to make it long enough that the rotor-based systems would work, but short enough that I didn't have to sit through a whole bunch of 2-hour-long days because I had to run this test numerous times. And if I stuffed anything up and I had to wait another 2 hours before doing it, oh, the rage. I didn't want to have to deal with that. So, first grid, nice and simple, 2 solar panels set up in a horizontal layout. Second grid, 2 solar panels, but sandwiched one on top of another. I'm interested to see just how much how much light is transmitted through to the panel below, and whether this might be an efficient way of setting up solar panels if you're very tight on space. Next up, we've got vertical panels. Then we've got panels set underneath a layer of glass. Same number of panels, same battery setup, same everything else, just set up under glass. Then we'll skip these 2 and come back to them later. Next, we've got 2 solar panels covered by half blocks. And then inside this thing is actually 2 more panels. You can see one here, and there's one at the other end as well. These are completely obscured from light by the armor blocks over the top of them. Next up, we've got 3 solar panels. Now, the reason these tests all have 3 is because I needed 3 for this particular setup. So I've repeated some of the tests so that we have a direct comparison between them as well. So we've got the 3 horizontal, the 3 vertical, and then we've got 3 in a box layout. 1 to capture the morning sun, 1 to capture the afternoon sun, and 1 to capture the midday sun. Next up, same idea, but arranged like a fan. Then we start going on to the solar panels that are set up with Izzy's script. First up, we've got just a vertical rotor with the 3 solar panels. Next, we've got a horizontal rotor with the 3 panels. And finally, we've got the double rotor setup, the same as I've got in my survival series. And I think there's a few things we would expect to have as outcomes from each of these tests. When we look at these solar panels and we think about the light, the way it works at the equator, you wouldn't expect a huge difference, or I wouldn't have expected a huge difference between the horizontal and the vertical. But that might not turn out to be true. So let's run these tests, and I'll show you some little time lapses that I came up with that hopefully look as pretty in my recordings as they did in my head. And then we'll get on to the results. Oh, forgot one thing. Need to come back to these 2. So these 2 are another little test. This is more about how power systems work than how solar panels work. But if you're using a mixed power system, what you would want is for your solar panels, the power from them, to be used in preference to everything else. So if your solar panels are working and able to provide all of the power you need, then no other power system should be used. That's the way you would ideally like it to be, since solar power once the panels are built, is effectively free. Not true of reactors, where you still need to have uranium. So what these two have set up is one just running an arc furnace with a whole bunch of iron in it and the reactor. Then this one with the solar panel and the reactor. What we should see after a day of running these two is that the one on the right has slightly more uranium in the reactor than the one on the left. And now it's time for the time lapses. It's now time for us to take a look at the results. What we've got here is our polar testing rig. We've got a situation where the sun never actually sets. It stays above the horizon the entire way around. So, with that in mind, any of our vertical panels should be providing substantially more power than their horizontal counterparts. And if we compare these two vertical ones to these horizontal ones here, we can see that that's true. If we have a look here, we only get 969 watt hours out of a whole day's exposure to the sun. Whereas with our vertical ones, we're getting a full 60, probably 63 times as much with 62.25 kilowatt hours. That's a lot more. But what about some of the other smaller differences? Well, with our sandwiched ones, we're getting, let's have a look, 517 watt hours. So that's between half and 2/3 as much as the two that are separated like so, which is actually not too bad. It's more than half, so you are getting some power from the panel underneath. What about with glass on top? Well, with the glass on top, we're getting a very similar amount to what we get with the solar panels. So it seems like from the game's point of view, the solar panels and the glass both allow some light through. We'll come back to these two later. The half blocks, how much of the sunlight have they managed to block out? About half, well, no. They block out about 3/4 of it. Interesting. What about this one with the blocks everywhere? 817 watt hours. And I just noticed something that I made an error with and that I will fix up for the equatorial test. I might have left a solar panel on here that I did not mean to leave on here. So we'll ignore that result and we'll check it with the equatorial test. So we know that the horizontal ones produce very little power, and even with 3 of them, it's still, well, it's still crazy insignificant, the amount that you produce. What about if we've got a setup with the 3 vertical versus this box setup? Well, let's have a look here. How much power has managed to get into this battery? 93 kilowatt hours for the 3 verticals. And for the box setup, 42.63. So it's less than half. And the fan setup is going to be probably about the same, I would estimate. No, it's a huge amount less. I wonder if that has something to do with the fan only having a single vertical panel. With these 3 rotor-based setups, I think we can predict what our results are going to be. This setup with the vertical rotor is going to have a pretty good result. Assuming that the timer block and its power usage don't take away more than the gain compared to this vertical setup. So these are the two I want to compare. So we've got on this one 93.19 kilowatt hours, and with our spinning rotor setup with the timer and the rotor costing power, it's gained an extra 35, if my maths is right. 35 kilowatt hours over the plain vertical setup. So the timer and the rotor definitely don't cost enough for the benefits that they reap. What about this one? This one's pretty much a timer and a rotor for no good because the thing's spinning around us, not over the top, which means this rotor probably doesn't need to do anything at all and is probably just wasting power. And we can see that that's true. It's got 86.34 kilowatt hours compared to the 93 of the plain vertical one. So it is just wasting power having a setup like that up here on the pole. What about our double setup? Do we gain anything from the horizontal rotor? And I'm going to expect that we don't really. Oh, we gain a little bit. 134 compared to 123, I think it was? 128. So an extra 6 kilowatt hours a day for the extra rotor. Might be worth it depending on our situation. These results are going to vary dependent on position on the planet, and that's why I've run 2 more tests. But before we look at those, let's check out our power distribution system test. So in this test, we were looking at whether the uranium used to convert the 100,000 units of iron ore into iron ingots would be reduced by having solar panels, because the solar power should be used preferentially and allow the nuclear reactor to produce less power. And the way we're going to compare that is that we know both of these started with a full 100 kilograms of uranium. The one without solar panels has been left with 99.91. The one with the solar panels, 99.93. All I wanted to see here was that there was a difference, and there is. The magnitude of that difference is obviously going to be dependent on the number of solar panels you have and potentially other factors, but the big point here is it does make a difference. The system does work as you would want it to. The solar panels, they will be used first. Let's jump to our next testing rig site and see what things are like there. For this next test site, I picked a spot high up in the mountains that's still fairly close to the pole, but further away, and I tried to pick somewhere that was reasonably usable as a midpoint between the equator and the pole, but more elevated than either site. And for this one, the main differences we want to check out here are between the vertical and the horizontal. At this elevation, the sun does get high enough, as you can see here, to strike the horizontal solar panels nicely. So we should see less of a difference between the horizontal and vertical. And maybe even better from the horizontal. So we've got 44.47 kilowatts there. And we've got 62.22. So still vertical is better. And we probably are closer to the pole here, so that's reasonable to have that outcome. For this site, the more interesting tests are this box and the 3 rotor setups. So we know our horizontal one doesn't do as well as the vertical, and with the triple setup, we've got 60 kilowatt hours. With the triple vertical, we've got 98, so even more than it had at the pole. And with our box setup, we've got 61. Was that more than the horizontal or less? Just barely more. So having the 2 vertical panels, although we obstruct ourselves partially as the sun goes behind, just barely improves on the horizontal. We'd still be better having 3 vertical and static. What about the fan setup? Oh, it actually harms it. That may be a combination of because of the shading and also because of the lack of the extra vertical panel. What about our vertical versus our horizontal rotors? At the pole, we knew that our vertical rotor was going to be better, and it was better by an enormous margin. Now that we're getting closer to the equator though, the sun moves across a 45-degree sort of elevation, or not really a 45-degree elevation, but it's not perfectly vertical and it's not basically at the horizontal. It's somewhere in between, and that means that we're going to need to move in both angles. So we should see a bigger advantage to the double articulated setup than either of the single ones. And depending on how close we are to the exact midpoint between the equator and the pole, should affect how much each one of these advantages over the other. So we've got 123 kilowatt hours with our single, and 120. So these are pretty much the same. I got this point a bit closer than I expected to. That's kind of nice. That's what I was hoping for. That these two would be about the same. And that means this one should beat both of them by a decent margin. And does it? Yes, it does. 145 kilowatt hours. So if you're somewhere in between the pole and the equator, you definitely get a big bonus out of having the double articulated setup. And that's roughly where I am on my survival world, so I feel good that I went with that design. Next up, and final test, let's jump to the equator. Let's look at the thing that I stuffed up at every other site and see whether this box with the solar panels hidden inside actually generates power. And sadly, it does. 31.84 kilowatt hours produced, with solar panels set completely obscured within a box. Hopefully they fix that one, because that's a bit of a bug that I would hope wasn't actually there. The ones we want to compare now that we're at the equator are the vertical to the horizontal. This spot is pretty close to exactly on the equator. When we look at the shadows passing across the ground, they do pass basically dead in a line. And that means that from the time the sun rises, it's just going to go straight over the top of these panels. So these panels will be getting power from dawn until dusk. But so will the vertical. And the vertical and horizontal in this setup, you'd think should be almost exactly the same. The difference being that at dawn, the vertical's getting its maximum, and at dusk it's getting its maximum, and then it goes to the midday position where it'll be getting about the same power as these horizontal ones get at dawn. Is that the case though? Let's have a look. Our horizontal panels have managed to accumulate 55.31 kilowatt hours, whereas the vertical ones have produced a significant amount more. And that's a big enough difference that I'm convinced that the vertical did better. Given any other irregularities I implemented in the test, a 50% gain is too big to be ignored. What this suggests to me is something that I had not thought of before. And that is, in almost all situations, if you can't build rotors, if you can't build any sort of mobile system, vertical panels are going to be almost equal to or better than a horizontal setup. And usually significantly better than a horizontal setup. The equatorial setup is actually the closest you come to parity between the two, and there's still a 50% difference. So from now on, every solar panel is getting attached like the one I attached to my little rover. Vertical, like a mohawk. What about the box? The box should get a reasonable benefit out of being at the equator, because it's going to get the benefit of the sun going straight over the top and producing consistent power throughout the day. Let's have a look at how it compares to our vertical setup. 41.17, that's substantially less. That's less than half. No, it's not. But it's less than the horizontal and it's less than the vertical. Because of the shadow we create, we're actually losing a lot of power. And even though this box does produce some power, it doesn't produce nearly as much as the exposed ones. It's still a lot less. And the fan setup, I think, is going to do pretty similarly poorly. Slightly better than the box, actually. And then we have our rotors. Since we're at the equator, we would expect that our horizontal rotor is going to be a better performer than our vertical. But we know that our vertical panels do better than our horizontal. Let's have a look. This one, 73.28, and this one, 99.06. Phew, it met our expectations. The horizontal one at the equator does very well. But does it do well enough to mean that you wouldn't bother with the double articulation? Well, yeah, it might do. That's only a very small difference. That's only 4 kilowatt hours difference for an entire day's power. And that's, what, just a bit over 4%? That's not a very big difference. With these tests, one important thing to note is we're talking relatives here. The absolute numbers that I've generated here are virtually meaningless. They're only meaningful in comparison to the other test subjects used in these tests. Because I've used a 30-minute day, which is shorter than most people play with, and because I've used 3 panels when... How often do we use just 3 panels? The amount of power generated by them is so small that we'll only use that until we have more. But the important thing that I've discovered from these tests is, one, I've confirmed that the power distribution works as expected. Solar panel power is used first and is used preferentially over power from reactors. And vertical panels, they're the bomb. If you can't build a rotor setup, just stick your panels straight up in the sky. Anywhere you are, that's going to be your best bet. And if for some reason you decide you want to cover your panels with glass, or sandwich your panels together like so, you'll still actually get benefit from the panels beneath the glass or the panel beneath the other one, which is kind of cool. If we're really tight on space, we could do a double vertical sandwich setup, or with our rotor-based setups, we could actually add another layer to them, which would take up no more space, but would give us a fraction more power than we were getting before. So, might be worth it depending on your situation. Another thing I've learned from these numbers that we've generated here is that if you're going to use solar power on a planet, you're actually going to be best off in one of the temperate zones. Your days are longer, and because Space Engineers doesn't calculate the distance of light travel through the atmosphere and attenuate light based on that, you actually end up with more power overall. So, mountain setups, here we come. So that's most of what I wanted to test with solar panels. If you've got any other ideas of things worth testing, please let me know. I do want to do a video in the future on power systems as a whole, and in that one I want to look at something that's been mentioned a couple of times in the comments and that I've read on the wiki, or on one of the wikis I should say, which is that power generated by uranium reactors going to batteries isn't as efficient as if that power was used directly. Solar panels are fully 100% efficient when charging batteries, but not uranium-based reactors. So I'll be interested to test if that's in fact still true. Next week, we're back to another autopilot video. As always, there's that and plenty more to come, so I'll see you then.